what do you all think the will of D really is? Even now in the Elbaf arc, and in the Rocks flashback, we've seen Imu display an overwhelming, devilish power of control. And from the way Imu despises the D name, it's clear that this will traces all the way back to Joy Boy's era, 800 years ago. The one who inherited that will 24 years ago was, without a doubt, Gol D. Roger. He once said he wished he'd been born in the same era as Joy Boy, which shows how deeply he connected with Joy Boy's ideals. And, as we know, Roger's words left behind 3 ideas that define the world of One Piece itself: inherited will, the ebb and flow of the times, the dreams of humankind. Among those, I want to focus this time on inherited will. If people like Joy Boy, Roger, Odin, and Ace represent the side of the D, those who pass down their will by giving their lives and leaving a deep impact on the hearts of others, then Imu and the 5 elders embody the opposite, rejecting the very concept of death and maintaining absolute control through their own power alone. That's why it makes perfect sense that Brook, who has already experienced death once, and Yonko, who possesses an undying body, share a connection in their past, and are now being highlighted together in the Elbaf arc. By the way, the cover for One Piece Volume 113 was recently revealed, and it turns out Yonko's hair is blue. Since Vivi also has blue hair, it's possible that Imu sees traces of Queen Lily in both of them. Maybe that's why Imu made Yonko immortal and keeps her close, while still searching for Vivi. Either way, I believe that as the battle in Elbaf continues, the themes of death and the will of D will become even more central. So in today's video, we'll dive deep into that biggest mystery of all, the will of D, by breaking down Roger and his crew in detail. By the way, in my last video, I talked about a certain YouTuber who threatened me, saying I should stick to analysis, not Japanese explanations. I really appreciated all the encouraging comments I received after that. Thank you so much. There are actually a few other creators who've been attacking my content as well, but Oda Sensei himself once said in SBS about YouTube creators. He said, "Just have fun and get along with each other." So for now, I'm just ignoring the negativity. If anything serious happens, I might ask you viewers for your opinions, so I hope you'll share your thoughts when that time comes. Also, up until now, I used to collect SBS question submissions by sending in the comments that got the most likes, but since that could be seen as pressuring people to like certain comments, I've decided to change how I do it. I'll explain the new method in more detail on my Patreon page. There, you'll find discussions on the themes you submit, along with nearly 200 posts that include Japanese native translations of the latest One Piece chapters every week. If you're interested in the nuances of the original version of One Piece, I'd love for you to come check it out. The biggest question is why Roger became a pirate in the first place. Actually, his background is still completely shrouded in mystery. The earliest period we've ever seen of his life is this scene, the one where he meets Rayleigh. At that time, Roger didn't really seem like a pirate. He came across more like a young man simply out to explore the world. But even then, he said something very striking. "Let's turn the world upside down." Interestingly, Rocks once referred to Imu as the world, which in hindsight was actually pretty accurate. On the surface, the 5 elders are portrayed as the supreme rulers of the world, but it's been revealed that they basically just act according to Imu's will. And one of Imu's signature abilities is called Domi Reversi. Like in a game of Othello, it literally flips people, turning them into devil-like beings with completely altered personalities. This idea of flipping or reversing, hikurikais, matches perfectly with Roger's words. In other words, Roger was trying to flip the very system of the world ruled by Imu. I actually explained this before in an earlier video, but lately I've been surprised to see more and more people picking up on this idea and talking about it too. So today, let's take things a step further and dive a little deeper into this theory. If Imu represents the world itself, then it means that in order to turn the world upside down, he's the one who must be overturned. I think there's another person who's already understood this meaning: Monkey D. Dragon. When Dragon first founded the Revolutionary Army, their flag featured a simple sword design, but the current version has been redesigned. Now the sword appears to be piercing through a dragon. If you flip that flag upside down, you can see shapes resembling a crown and an eye at the top. That might actually be a hidden clue about Imu's true face. In other words, the Revolutionary Army's very emblem could symbolize their mission, the determination to turn the current world itself upside down, to overthrow Imu, the being who represents the world's existing order. It seems Dragon never told the other members of the Revolutionary Army, like Ivankov, about Imu's existence. So while he might not have fully understood who Imu was, he likely saw Imu appear at God Valley and realized that this figure was the true leader behind the world government. That's probably what inspired him to design the Revolutionary Army's flag the way he did. That said, the people living in the world of One Piece have no way of knowing that such a ruler even exists. The idea of turning the world upside down isn't something that an ordinary person in the One Piece world would ever even imagine. Most people genuinely believe that the celestial dragons are gods, the creators of the world itself. But for some reason, long before Roger ever reached Laugh Tale and learned the true history, he already knew that the world was something that needed to be overturned. That knowledge must have come from somewhere, most likely passed down through his own bloodline, the Gol D family. Rox D. Zebek, too, seemed to know about Imu's existence from the very beginning. That's probably because the Davy family had been passing down the truth about the world's structure for generations. If that's the case, then it's possible the Gol family also inherited a similar level of secret knowledge about history. In the end, Roger accomplished what no one else ever could. He sailed all the way around the Grand Line and uncovered every hidden secret of the world. Naturally, you'd think that after learning all that, he would have tried to change the world. But instead, he turned himself into the Marines and was publicly executed. He was already nearing the end of his life because of an illness. But above all, this line of his explains everything. We were too early. So what exactly was it that came too early? That, of course, was the birth of the mermaid princess. In other words, during Roger's time, she hadn't been born yet, which means the world simply wasn't ready for the great change he foresaw. That's why Roger asked Charlie to confirm the era in which the mermaid princess would be born. Roger probably believed that in the same generation as the mermaid princess, there would also be a child born with a spirit like his, and like Joy Boy's. And what becomes important here is none other than Nika's devil fruit. The fact that the fruit never reached Roger, even though he carried Joy Boy's will, was likely because it just wasn't time yet. He must have realized that the fruit was destined to fall into the hands of his true successor someday. And that's where Shanks comes in, the one who inherited Roger's will and took on the role of delivering that destiny. However, there's another huge problem with the Nika's fruit. It hadn't awakened for over 800 years. Even if someone inherited Joy Boy's or Roger's will, if they couldn't awaken Nika's power, then the dream, their long-awaited hope, could never be fulfilled. The answer, it seems, lies in the dawn of the pirate era. We learned from Kaido's explanation that awakening a devil fruit requires not just the heart, but also the body to grow. In other words, no matter how strong your spirit or how grand your dream is, if your body isn't developed enough to handle that power, you'll never reach awakening. To create an environment that would cultivate such growth, Roger left his treasure on the Grand Line, guiding people toward it. In the current era, compared to Roger's time, the Grand Line is overrun with even more powerful pirates, engaging in fierce battles. The Yonko, the Shichibukai, and the Worst Generation, Luffy has faced countless obstacles along the way. It's safe to say that these relentless challenges are what allowed Luffy to strengthen his body through numerous battles and ultimately achieve his awakening. The moment Shanks confirmed Nika's awakening, he decided to go after the One Piece. This suggests that Nika's awakening was a crucial element in realizing the world Roger had envisioned. At this point, you're probably thinking the same thing. Originally, Roger set out on his journey to turn the world upside down. If he realized that, just because he was born in the wrong era, he couldn't change the world himself, you'd expect him to be crushed by that truth. You could even say his dream was shattered. And yet, he didn't seem broken by it at all. Why was he able to accept it so calmly? The key lies in the idea of inherited will, or what we call the will of D. Roger knew that his will would be carried on by someone in the future. In fact, even before reaching Laugh Tale, he told Pedro something very meaningful. Everyone gets their moment to shine. So basically, Roger's role was to reveal the existence of Laugh Tale to the world, and then pass the baton, the will of D, to the final runner. In other words, even if Roger himself couldn't be the one to flip the world, if someone inheriting his will were to achieve it, that would still be his victory, his legacy. And in truth, Luffy's journey has advanced incredibly fast, precisely because of Roger's influence. Thanks to the message Roger carved into the Golden Bell on Sky Island, Robin was able to understand the meaning behind the Rio poneglyph. And because Inuarashi and Nekomamushi, former members of Roger's crew, met Luffy's group, they learned that to reach Laugh Tale, they'd need the 4 road poneglyphs, saving them an enormous amount of time compared to Roger's own voyage. You could say that Luffy's entire adventure is Roger's will brought to life. So if Luffy and his crew eventually manage to turn the world upside down, that moment will stand as proof that Roger truly lived. That said, Roger could have kept all the treasure on Laugh Tale for himself and lived out the rest of his life in luxury, but he didn't. Because for him, the real value wasn't in owning treasure or living a life of wealth. What he truly valued was the journey itself, the thrill of adventure and the rivalry that came with it. Even in the Vivre card, it's stated that his hobby was adventure. And personally, I think it's really meaningful that the Roger pirates sang Binksasake during their voyages. To me, the most important line in that song is, "After all, we all end up as bones someday." Because in the end, even if you find the greatest treasure in the world, everyone dies eventually. In fact, for us humans, it's the journey, the struggles, the effort, the small moments along the way that stays with us far longer than the result itself. That's why so many people feel empty after finally reaching a big goal. They expected happiness in the outcome, but the real meaning, the real fulfillment, was always in the path that led them there. So then, will Luffy feel empty when he finally finds Laugh Tale? No, I don't think so. That's because Oda Sensei has already prepared something beyond that goal, what Luffy calls the end of his dream. Yume no Hate. That's why I believe this end of the dream isn't something that can be clearly achieved or checked off a list. It's something that will keep bringing him joy as long as he's alive, something that keeps his spirit burning. In other words, this grand project that began with Joy Boy has been passed down from Roger to Luffy. That's why Luffy is the final runner in this great relay, the anchor of the race. And the key element needed to fulfill this cross-generational dream is the will of D. And by the way, there's someone else who hinted at this same inherited will, none other than Rox D. Zebek. He says this line, "As long as I can get my wife and kid out of here, that's enough. I don't feel like luck's on my side, Harold." Doesn't that sound like he already sensed his own death was coming? Think about it. This is a man with an enormous ambition to take over the world, and yet here he's saying, "As long as my wife and kid escape, that's enough." Oda Sensei even puts emphasis on that phrase, "that's enough." To me, that shows Rox believed that even if he died physically, his soul would live on through his child, Teach, who would carry on his will. That's why he could say something like that with conviction. And that ties right into Blackbeard's Jolly Roger, the 3 skulls. They represent 3 generations of will. Teach himself, Rox, whose soul he inherited, and Davy Jones, the figure Rox revered. If that's the case, then here's how I see it. The Ds who carry the will of dawn, the ones who bring light to the world, are represented by Joy Boy, and the Ds who carry the will of dusk, those who plunge the world into darkness, are represented by Davy Jones. One of the core themes in One Piece is the will that gets passed down. In other words, they'll end up carrying the weight of the past, whether they realize it or not, as they fight. Joy Boy's will was passed down through Roger and eventually to Luffy. Davy Jones's will was passed down through Rox, and now to Blackbeard. And honestly, the clash between Luffy and Blackbeard, their deep-rooted connection, it's been foreshadowed so many times throughout the story. Luffy and Blackbeard first met at the pub in Mocktown. Luffy hated the cherry pie, but it was Blackbeard's favorite. Meanwhile, Blackbeard hated the drink, but Luffy loved it. It was a perfect little contrast between the two. What really stood out to me, though, is what happened right after they left the pub. Luffy didn't respond to any of Blackbeard's questions. Not a word. Instead, he gave him this look, like he already understood who Blackbeard really was. And it wasn't just that. Even though Luffy doesn't know yet that Blackbeard has a connection to Ace or Shanks, the fact that these two cross his mind in that moment feels really significant. Up to this point, we've been talking about the idea of an inherited will, but there's someone who lives by the complete opposite ideology. That person is Nerona Imu. Instead of dying and passing his will on to the next generation, Imu seeks to make himself immortal, to ensure that his will is always fulfilled by his own hand, forever. Even after gaining enough treasure to change the entire world, Roger chose to let it all go. While Imu and the 5 elders cling desperately to their own lives and power, Roger, who could entrust his will to the next generation, lived freely and was able to die without regret. That's why he smiled at the moment of his death. Imu, on the other hand, even after attaining absolute power, is constantly haunted by the fear of losing it. He gained eternal life to preserve his own glory, but that only trapped him in endless fear, forever living in terror that one day it might all come to an end. By the way, the phrase inherited will has already been used as a chapter title, and that chapter actually hides a major hint about its meaning. It's chapter 145 from the Drum Island arc, the one where Dr. Hiraluk talks about that very philosophy. Interestingly, both he and Roger are connected through the image of cherry blossoms. In Japanese culture, cherry blossoms symbolize Shogyo Mujo, the Buddhist idea of impermanence. It's the reminder that no matter how great your power or glory becomes, everything eventually comes to an end, a beautiful expression of life's fragility. Roger understood this well, which is likely why he disbanded his crew and surrendered shortly after becoming the Pirate King. This is also one of the reasons why Whitebeard never sought the title of Pirate King until the end. Roger, Whitebeard, Heup, and Odin, each of them fully understood that life is short. That's why they were determined to pass on their will to the next generation. In their view, even if their lives were brief, as long as there were people to carry on their will, they could live on forever. This raises a big question. Why did Heup hold this philosophy? I believe Heup might have adopted this way of thinking after coming into contact with Roger. Heup mentioned that he had been researching the miracle Sakura for 30 years as of 8 years ago. This means that he started his research 37 years ago, suggesting that just before that, he was in a country far west of Drum Kingdom, where he witnessed the miracle Sakura. Now, do you remember what happened 1 year before that? Yes, the God Valley incident. This event took place 38 years ago in the West Blue. I think Oda Sensei specifically set the God Valley incident 38 years ago to align with the time when Heup was in the West Blue. It's likely that during his time in the West Blue, Heup encountered Roger and his crew. Hearing about Roger's adventures and philosophy, Heup came to take pride in the idea of being a pirate. That's probably why he encouraged Chopper to become a pirate and set out to sea. At that time, he said he would fight like a pirate. So what was he planning to fight against? It was probably the incurable disease he was suffering from. After all, Roger also battled a terminal illness and still became the Pirate King. By the way, Heup returned from the West Blue, crossing the red line to the opposite side to Drum Kingdom, which is located in the first half of the Grand Line. In the world of One Piece, crossing the red line to reach the other side is a perilous journey, and it's hard to imagine that Heup, who was just a thief and not a pirate, could have made that voyage alone. Yes, you've probably noticed it by now. It all makes sense if we consider that he might have returned to Drum Kingdom aboard Roger's ship. There's also a very interesting note in the One Piece magazine. Contact with Kureha on Drum Island. This suggests that Roger had met Kureha on Drum Island at some point. In fact, Kureha knew Roger's true name was Gol D. Roger, and she mentioned the will of D, which implies she might have heard about the meaning of D directly from Roger. This makes it highly likely that Roger visited Drum Kingdom with Heup after the God Valley incident. And their encounter at that time might have been on the distant western island where Heup mentioned the cherry blossoms were in full bloom. Inherited will, the ebb and flow of an era, the dreams of people. As long as people continue to seek the meaning of freedom, these things will never cease. Roger must have shared that very philosophy with Heup. In other words, the will of D could be seen as the act of passing one's will on through death. You could even call it the will of death. That's why pirates who proudly carry the mark of death as their emblem are the ones who've inherited the will of D. And when Luffy first met Kobe, he said this: "I've decided to become the Pirate King. If I have to fight and die for that, then so be it." By the way, I share translations of One Piece magazine with my Patreon members. I've translated and shared this special feature on Roger on my page. It will be available for free for a few days after this video is released, so if you're interested, please check it out. you might discover new insights that support your theories. The One Piece magazine also touches on the first meeting between Roger and Rayleigh. The word used here is quite rare. It's read as kaiko, meaning an unexpected encounter. Now, let's take a look at Roger's fighting techniques. Even in the way his attacks are named, there's a clear sense of consistency, and I think that's a deliberate hint from Oda-sensei. Let's start with Roger's signature move, Kamusari, or Divine Departure. The name Kamusari actually appears in Kojiki, one of Japan's oldest historical texts. The Kojiki is a compilation of Japanese myths and ancient legends, essentially the foundation of Japan's mythology. The literal meaning of Kamusari breaks down like this. The first kanji means god or deity, and the second means to separate or to withdraw. When combined, they form Kamusari, a very old poetic expression used to describe the moment when a god departs from the human world or when a divine being dies or disappears from existence. In mythology, it's sometimes used to describe Izanami's descent into Yomi, the land of the dead, when they leaves the world of the living. So, the name Kamusari carries the idea of a force so powerful it could drive even a god away, or erase a god from the world. That's probably why Oda-sensei chose this name for Roger's technique. In the story, when Roger used Kamusari, it was powerful enough to send Odin, who could fight Kaido evenly, flying with a single strike. And when Shanks used the same move, he knocked out Eustace Kid in one blow. It's without question one of the most powerful attacks in all of One Piece. If Roger had truly aimed to rule the world like Rox did, he might have been capable of driving away even the gods themselves with that technique. In the flashback leading up to the God Valley incident, Roger used another technique, one called Aramatama. Like Kamusari, this word also appears in Kojiki, one of Japan's oldest mythological texts. So what exactly does Aramatama mean? In ancient Japanese belief, it was thought that a god spirit, or divine essence, was made up of multiple aspects, each with different qualities. These were broadly divided into two types, Aramatama and Nigamatama. Aramatama represents the fierce, wild, and aggressive side of a deity, the outward, untamed energy. In contrast, Nigamatama symbolizes gentleness, compassion, and harmony. Because of its intensity, Aramatama was said to hold the power to create new things, to bring forth change or destruction that leads to rebirth. So naming Roger's attack Aramatama feels incredibly fitting. It perfectly reflects his haki, raw, explosive, and filled with the energy to reshape the world itself. So why did Oda-sensei choose to name Roger's attacks with words like Kamusari and Aramatama, both of which come from the Kojiki? It's probably because the Kojiki contains deep connections to the Shinto concept of the soul, the spiritual essence that lies at the heart of life and divinity. By the way, the Yomi no Kuni, land of the dead, that Brook once reached in his soul form also comes from the Kojiki. And Roger once told Rayleigh, "I won't die, partner." Odin said something similar just before his death. "My soul will live on." And we actually saw that happen when Hiyori played her song Tsukihime. The sword, Enma, which once belonged to Odin, responded to her melody and began drawing in Zoro's haki. So it seems Roger had mastered a technique built on understanding the very nature of the soul, refining it, transforming it, and turning that spiritual energy into power itself. That's why his attack was called Aramatama, the embodiment of a raging, living soul. Vegapunk once told Kuma, "The soul truly does exist." And even after losing his personality completely, Kuma somehow acted on his own, appearing at Egghead as if guided by will, just to protect Bonnie. Now that I think about it, Big Mom's abilities also made the soul visible, literally turning it into something you could see, and Brook, after his soul once traveled to the land of the dead, gained the ability to control the chill of the underworld itself. So I think it's clear that the concept of the soul is going to play a major role in One Piece from here on out. And Roger went even further. He could hear voices not just from living things, but even from inanimate objects like the poneglyphs. Rayleigh described this ability as the power to hear the voice of all things. One of the biggest highlights in Chapter 1151 is this scene. We finally get to see the monster trio back in action, but what really stood out is how Luffy reacted. Even though he couldn't see it with his own eyes, he said, "Chopper's falling." It's like he could sense Chopper falling from the surface world above. Luffy himself was confused. He didn't know how he knew it was Chopper, but that's exactly why I think this is a sign. A sign that he's starting to awaken the ability to hear the voice of all things, the same power Roger was said to have. Now, some people rely too much on Google Translate and say this phrase only refers to objects because it includes the kanji for thing, but that's not what the term banbutsu really means. In Japanese, it refers to everything in existence, all things in the universe. That includes people. So when we say the voice of all things, we're not just talking about inanimate objects. It means the ability to hear every voice, living or non-living. For example, in Wano Kuni, when Shanks released that overwhelming conqueror's haki, Luffy smiled and said, "A familiar face just popped into my head." Even Aramaki, who was far away at the time, instantly realized that haki belonged to Shanks the moment it hit him. And on Egghead, when Borsalino landed, Luffy sensed him right away. A strong one's arrived. So yeah, up until now, Luffy has only been able to sense powerful haki being emitted. But now, it feels like that's changing. He's beginning to sense people even if they're not using haki, as long as their emotions or presence are strong enough. This could be the start of something huge. So basically, what happened is that Luffy sensed Chopper's will, and he picked up on it in the form of haki. Now, I know what a lot of you are probably thinking. Wait, but Chopper can't even use haki? That's true. But the real question here is, what exactly is haki at its core? Rayleigh explained it to Luffy like this. Listen, Luffy. Haki is a power that lies dormant in every single person in the world. It's awareness, fighting spirit, presence, intimidation. It's not some special superpower. It's a natural part of being human. Most people just never realize they have it, or never manage to draw it out. In other words, even if most people in the One Piece world never awaken something like observation haki, armament haki, or conqueror's haki, they all carry some form of it. At the very least, everyone has a presence, what we'd call ki in Japanese or fighting spirit. Now, take a look at Chopper as he's falling. You can clearly see how desperate he is to save Gaban. That determination, that resolve, that's pure willpower. And Luffy? He's finally reaching a point where he can feel that kind of will, even from someone who isn't consciously releasing haki. That's exactly what Roger's voice of all things was about. Rayleigh even said this to Luffy once. Even among those who use observation haki, you have a special gift for sensing the feelings of ikimono. In Japanese, the word ikimono technically means a living creature, but in everyday use, it almost always refers to non-human animals. Luffy's always had this natural ability to connect with non-human animals. He even tamed the beasts of the underworld in an instant. And since Chopper is half reindeer, that might have made it even easier for Luffy to sense him. So what exactly is the role of this voice of all things? When Robin asked Rayleigh why Roger was able to read the ancient script, he simply replied, "Roger could hear the voice of all things. That's all." But if we look closely, Roger couldn't actually read the poneglyphs themselves. The one who deciphered them was Odin. So that tells us something. This ability isn't about translating ancient texts. It must have some other purpose. And I believe that purpose is directly connected to reaching Laugh-Tale. Inuarashi once described Laugh-Tale as an invisible island. And it makes sense. Nobody had ever made it there before the Roger pirates, and since then, no one else has either. Now, if Laugh-Tale were just a normal island floating in the sea, you'd think someone would have stumbled across it by accident by now. And if it were underwater, maybe a passing fishman or a submarine could have discovered it. Even someone with flight powers like Arbor might have spotted it from above. But no one has seen it. According to the pamphlet from the movie Film Red, it says Conqueror's Haki also has the ability to suppress your presence and block others from using observation Haki on you. It looks like Shamrock could also erase his presence at will. That's why I think Laugh-Tale's presence has been completely erased, hidden from all detection by Joy Boy's overwhelming Conqueror's Haki. It's like the entire island has been cloaked, its presence wiped out from the world. So to find it, you don't just need maps or glyphs, you need someone who can hear those voices. And I believe that once Luffy fully awakens this power, that's when he'll finally be able to step foot on Laugh-Tale. Now, let's talk about Rayleigh. Until recently, it's been a mystery why he was called May-O. In the English version, his title is translated as Dark King, but the nuance in Japanese is actually quite different. A more direct translation would be King of the Underworld. There's a key scene at God Valley that hints at the true meaning behind that name. When Rayleigh saves Shakuyaku, he says to Summers, "I'll offer you to the underworld, Higanbana." That line, I believe, is the origin of his epithet. It's a metaphor. Rayleigh is the kind of man who sends his defeated enemies to the underworld, and that's why he's known as the King of the Underworld. Interestingly, the name May-O is also used for a celestial body, the dwarf planet Pluto. If you take the kanji for May-O, meaning King of the Underworld, and add the kanji for star, you get May-O-sei. Now here's where it gets even more fascinating. Luffy, too, is referred to by a cosmic title, supernova. If we look at the solar system, there are 8 planets, not counting Pluto. So if Luffy, the sun god, represents the sun, then the rest of the Straw Hat crew, back before the time skip, could each be seen as one of the 8 planets orbiting around him. In that sense, when Rayleigh protected the Straw Hats from Borsellino at Sabayodi, and later trained Luffy in Haki, it created a perfect image. Rayleigh as Pluto, the distant planet, quietly watching over the sun. And there's more. Teach's mother's name is Eris. Interestingly, there's also a dwarf planet called Eris. Ironically, the discovery of this very dwarf planet is said to be one of the main reasons Pluto was downgraded from a planet to a dwarf planet. It's half a joke, of course. But remember how Rayleigh once said he disliked Blackbeard? If Oda Sensei actually based that detail on the fact that Eris's discovery caused Pluto's demotion, that would be a hilarious bit of hidden symbolism. And now, one of Rayleigh's new techniques has been revealed. It's called Higanbana. Let's take a closer look at that word. In the Japanese version of One Piece, most attack names are written using a mix of kanji and kana. This allows Oda Sensei to layer multiple meanings into a single technique name. The kana determines how the move is pronounced, while the kanji gives it deeper nuance, chosen freely by Oda Sensei based on the move's image or concept. It's something only possible in Japanese, a language that uses 3 writing systems, and it's really an art form in itself. Now, the reading for this move is Higanbana, which you've probably heard before. It's written as this, the Japanese word for the red spider lily. Let's break down the kanji. Higan is a Buddhist term referring to a specific period of religious observance, and the ba and na parts are written with the kanji for blade and machete, respectively. The Higanbana, or red spider lily, blooms around the time of O-Higan, a Buddhist week that happens in both spring and autumn. Because it often grows near cemeteries during that season, it's strongly associated with death and farewell. Higan refers to the week surrounding the spring or autumn equinox, 7 days in total, 3 before and 3 after the day itself. In Japan, this is believed to be the time when the distance between this world and the next becomes thinner, so people visit graves and honor their ancestors. That's why the fact that Rayleigh, known as the king of the underworld, uses a technique named Higanbana feels incredibly fitting. It perfectly ties his image to the theme of the boundary between life and death. By the way, the word Higan actually originates from a Buddhist term. It refers to a specific place. In Buddhism, this world, filled with earthly desires and attachments, known as Bono, is contrasted with Higan, the other shore, a place free from desire. So the O-Higan period in Japan was seen as a time for people to reflect and train themselves, a way to free their minds from the worldly desires known as Bono. And speaking of Bono, that word actually shows up in Zoro's attacks too. Remember pound cannon? The pronunciation is written in kana as pond ho, but the kanji version is bon no ho, which combines earthly desires and phoenix. That's classic Oda Sensei, a clever play on words with deep meaning hidden underneath. And it doesn't stop there. Many of Zoro's techniques are inspired by Buddhist imagery. For example, Sanzen Sekai, 3,000 worlds, refers to the Buddhist concept of a vast, layered universe. Kokoba Tiger Hunt contains the word Kokoba, which is actually the name of a hell in Buddhist lore. And Rokudo no Tsuji, crossroads of the 6 paths, literally means the entrance to the underworld. So many of his moves are tied to Buddhism in one way or another. Then, of course, there's Enma, the sword Zoro obtained in Wano. Enma is the great king of hell who judges the deeds and sins of humans after death. Right after gaining that sword, Zoro used an attack called No Santoryu, King of Hell, 3-sword style. So maybe, just as Rayleigh is known as the king of the underworld, once Luffy becomes the pirate king, Zoro might someday be known as the king of hell. Now, let's move on to Gaban. Gaban is also referred to as the Pirate King's left hand. But what exactly does left hand mean? It's probably something we'd have to ask Oda Sensei directly in an SBS, but in Japan, we often hear expressions like the president's right hand or the president's left hand. There isn't a strict definition, but from my own sense as someone living in Japan, the right hand represents offense, action, initiative, while the left hand gives the feeling of defense or support. I'm left-handed, so for me it's reversed, but since around 90% of people in Japan are right-handed, that's where this image comes from. For example, when you open a jar, your dominant hand does the main action, while your non-dominant hand supports it. It might not move as freely, but it stabilizes and keeps balance. That's the kind of nuance this expression carries. So if Rayleigh was Roger's right hand and Gaban his left, then for the Straw Hat crew, Zoro would be the right hand and Sanji the left. Zoro wields Enma, the ultimate weapon for attack, while Sanji gained the powerful Germa body, which strengthens him as a defender. The perfect support. That said, there's no official right hand or left hand title between Sanji and Zoro right now, so it'll be interesting to see how the world ultimately comes to view their roles when the story reaches its end. Gaban was also described by Hirudin as one of the Ryo-Yoku of the Pirate King, alongside the Mei-O Rayleigh. The word Ryo-Yoku literally means both wings. In this context, it refers to the two people who stood on either side of the captain, the ones who supported him. That's probably why Robin once said that Sanji was one of the wings of the future Pirate King. She must have known that. Back in Roger's era, Rayleigh and Gaban were known as Roger's two wings. Now, I want to talk about the deeper meaning behind this idea of two wings. It actually carries a strong symbolic weight. Think of the wings of Icarus. In Greek mythology, Daedalus made wings for himself and his son Icarus by binding bird feathers with wax. But Icarus ignored his father's warning, flew too close to the sun, and the wax melted. His wings broke apart, and he fell into the sea. Interestingly, in One Piece, The Wings of Icarus was also the title of chapter 1114. That was the chapter where Vegapunk said he was erased for getting too close to the sun. In other words, for uncovering too much forbidden truth. He had developed the Mother Flame, a source of solar energy inspired by technology from the Void Century, and because of that, and his pursuit of the truth behind history, the world government decided to eliminate him. So what I'm getting at is this. To challenge something as massive as the world government, you need both wings firmly in place. Without two equally strong sides supporting the sun at the center, the captain, you can't hope to keep flying. In that sense, it's fair to say that Roger was able to become the Pirate King because he had both wings by his side. And the same goes for the Straw Hat crew. It's thanks to Luffy's two wings, who always take on the enemy's strongest fighters, that the crew has risen to such fame and strength. By contrast, Rox never had clearly defined wings, no true left and right hands to balance and support him, and that might be why he was ultimately destined to fall. Whitebeard might have been the closest thing to a right-hand man for Rox, but based on his line, "Who the hell said I was your subordinate, you idiot?" It's clear he never really saw himself as someone there to support Rox. From that perspective, if Lafitte is truly Blackbeard's right-hand man, then it's interesting, because he literally has two wings. That might be a symbolic sign that the day the Blackbeard pirates take over the world isn't far off. If we think about it that way, maybe even Joy Boy, 800 years ago, once had his own pair of wings, allies who stood beside him, but eventually lost them, or was betrayed by them, leading to his defeat. And if one of those wings happened to be an ancestor of the Figureland family, well, personally, I think that would make for a fascinating twist. Next, I'll talk about Gaban's technique from a native Japanese point of view. He's been waiting for the Straw Hat crew in Elbaf, but rather than just meeting them directly, he provoked them into stealing the key to Loki's handcuffs from him, almost as if he wanted to test their strength for himself. In that fight, we got a clear look at just how refined Gaban's observation haki has become. It really shows that even with age, the haki one has trained and mastered over the years doesn't fade away. In this scene, Gaban unleashes a powerful technique called Yasotakeru. The word yaso literally means 80, but in medieval Japan, it was often used more loosely, not as a specific number, but to express something vast, countless, or immense. That fits perfectly with Gaban's move, since it involves sending out countless slashes all at once. Interestingly, there's also a Japanese phrase, uso hapiyaku, literally 800 lies, which means a pack of lies. When Usopp boasted about having 8,000 subordinates, it wasn't a random number. The 8 or 80 symbolizes many, and it also plays into his reputation as a liar. Even his father's name, Yasopp, might come from this same linguistic connection. Now, let's look at the second part. Takeru. This word means a brave or mighty commander. The kanji used for it today is also read as fukuro, meaning owl, but originally it carried meanings like fierce or strong. You might recognize it from Tokyo Ghoul, where characters like Eito and Yoshimura are nicknamed Fukuro, the owl, likely drawing on that same symbolism of power. The character for Takeru also has connotations of a high-ranking military leader, or one who leads from the front. In fact, it's the same kanji used in the title for a fleet admiral in the Marines. In Japanese history, there's a famous figure named Yamato Takeru. He's a legendary prince and hero from Japanese mythology, known for his wild, fierce temperament, which even caused the emperor to keep his distance from him. Interestingly, the name Takeru also appears in One Piece itself. It's the name of Yamato's Iron Club. It's very likely that Oda Sensei drew inspiration from the legendary Yamato Takeru when creating both the character Yamato and her weapon, Takeru. There's probably another reason Gaban used such a massive technique to push Luffy into fighting seriously. In other words, he wanted to force out the true power of Nika. And the moment he saw Luffy transform into his white Nika form, Gaban immediately surrendered. That reaction shows that the former Roger pirates understand. The return of Nika is exactly what Roger had been waiting for all along. And the one who told Gaban about Luffy was none other than Shanks. In fact, it seems Shanks met Gaban in Elbaf at least 14 years ago and told him all about the adventures he'd had up to that point. But the first thing we need to talk about is this. On his left arm, there's a symbol, just like the ones we saw on Samar's and Kiringam's uniforms. It's still unclear whether that symbol is the one Kiringam mentioned, the one that lets you pass through the abyss. But considering Shanks spent some time in Mary Joie, that's definitely a real possibility. Why? Because back in the flashback with Roger, when Shanks was younger and wearing short sleeves, we could clearly see the area near his left elbow, and there was no mark there. So it makes sense to assume he got it sometime during his stay in Mary Joie. That said, as I talked about in another video, I believe Shanks's real goal isn't tied to the celestial dragons. What he's truly aiming for is to fulfill Roger's dream, to turn the world upside down. What's really interesting, though, is how casually Shanks talks to Gaban about having lived in Mary Joie. And Gaban? He straight up calls him the child of fate. That probably isn't just random. It's likely a reference to the fact that, yes, Shanks has celestial dragon blood, but because of a twist of fate, he was raised on the ship of the Pirate King. In other words, Shanks has always been a man shaped by destiny. We even saw that heartbreaking moment in Odin's flashback, when Roger tells Shanks something and Shanks breaks down in tears. It's entirely possible that was the moment Roger told him the truth about his origins, his bloodline, and everything tied to the history of the world. So then, why did Shanks go back to Mary Joie? It was probably because, in order to fulfill Roger's dream, he needed to understand the world from the world government's perspective. And interestingly, someone else has done something very similar. Kuzan. When he met Smoker on Punk Hazard, Kuzan said this: "There are things I can do even without being in the Marines, and there are things I can only see because I'm no longer part of it." In other words, to carry out his own version of justice, Kuzan chose to join the Blackbeard Pirates, despite how it looks on the surface. Now, in Shanks's case, I think he's doing something similar, but from the opposite angle. He used his celestial dragon bloodline to insert himself into a completely different system, one that stands on the other side of Roger's ideals. By doing that, he could learn how the world really works from the inside and figure out how to make Roger's dream come true. I think the answer might have been Nika. When Shanks visited Elbaf at that time, part of his reason was probably to learn more about Nika, who was worshipped there. And if Shanks still had ties to the God's Knights back then, it would make sense. He could have gotten insider intel that the Gomu Gomu no Mi was being transported on Who's Who's escort ship, which would explain how he was able to target it so precisely. And finally, here's a little bonus section for you. One of the biggest mysteries surrounding the Roger Pirates is that massive, mysterious egg we see aboard the Oro Jackson. In the Elbaf arc flashback, when the Roger Pirates appeared, they already had that egg with them. Back at Sabaody, Brooke said, "Gold Roger. I feel like I've heard that rookie's name somewhere before." Since the Rumbar Pirates also set sail 52 years ago, that means Roger was probably starting to make a name for himself as a rookie around that same time. And judging from the ship's design in the flashback, it's definitely the Oro Jackson, no doubt about it. So between about 52 and 44 years ago, Roger must have met Tom, acquired the Oro Jackson, and somehow obtained that giant egg as well. The biggest question, of course, is what exactly is that giant egg? One possibility I have been thinking about is that it might be a mystical bird. In One Piece, Oda Sensei has sometimes reused ideas and characters from his earlier one-shots, like Gil Bastar or Ryuma. And I believe one of those imported elements could be the Kaicho, the mysterious bird. This creature appeared in Oda-san's earlier work, Romance Dawn, where it was called Ruku, a bird with special powers. The name Ruku is actually one of several ways to pronounce rock, as in the rock bird from Middle Eastern and Indian Ocean mythology. Because Japanese writing uses katakana to approximate foreign words, rock can appear as Roku, Rufu, or Ruku, depending on the reading. In those legends, the rock is known as a massive white bird. So if that's the inspiration, the enormous size of the egg on the Oro Jackson makes perfect sense. We don't currently know where the Oro Jackson is being kept, but after the Roger Pirates disbanded, someone from the crew must have taken responsibility for that egg and cared for it. Personally, I think that person was Gaban. It's possible that his decision to stay in Elbaf was partly to keep watch over that egg. If you look closely at the houses and gates in the Elbaf village, you can see carvings that resemble the rock, decorative motifs that seem to honor the same kind of bird. And perhaps the one who eventually took in that creature was Shanks. According to the Elbaf guards, Shanks has visited the island many times. Maybe he kept coming back because Gaban had told him the egg was about to hatch, and Shanks wanted to be there to witness it. One detail that really stands out is how Shanks's saber has changed between the past and the present. Today, as one of the 4 emperors, Shanks wields a sword called Griffon. Its knuckle guard runs straight through the hilt, the grip itself is ridged, and the scabbard is gold. But if we look back at the saber Shanks carried 12 years ago, it was completely different. The knuckle guard didn't pierce through the handle. Instead, it spiraled in the opposite direction from the point where it met the grip. The handguard design wasn't like Griffin's either. It curved upward in an arch, forming a kind of dome shape. The grip had patterns similar to a Japanese katana, and the scabbard was blue. When Ace met Shanks 5 years ago, the saber he carried then was most likely Griffin, so we can tell that sometime between 12 and 5 years ago, Shanks replaced his sword. And what if the reason for that change was the hatching of the giant egg on the Oro Jackson? As mentioned earlier, in Romance Dawn, the mythical bird was said to have mystical power flowing in its blood. If we apply that idea to One Piece, that would mean this mysterious bird possessed the power of a devil fruit. So perhaps after it hatched, Shanks either forged Griffin using its power, or even fed the bird a devil fruit that allowed it to transform into a saber. If that's true, it would mean Shanks's current sword is literally born from that mythical bird. And if we take it one step further, his twin brother, Shamrock, could have done the same, but with the Cerberus fruit instead. That would make them perfect opposites, two brothers shaped by two different mythic creatures, one symbolizing the heavens, the other the underworld. By the way, at one point, Shanks attended someone's wedding carrying a saber that wasn't Griffin. It looked more like the sword he used to have about 12 years ago. In my Dawn Dusk video, I mentioned that in that scene where he looks up and speaks to someone, he might be talking to a giant. But now I'm starting to think he could have been speaking to the enormous mystical bird itself after it had returned to its normal form. That's probably why, at that time, he was carrying his old saber instead. Also, in the Elbaf arc, the story begins with Luffy and the crew being carried away, along with the Sunny, by a giant crow named Mugen. In the same way, maybe 2 years earlier during the Marineford War, that same kind of creature, the mysterious bird from the Oro Jackson, carried the Red Force all the way from the New World back to the first half of the Grand Line.